We're going over highlights of the last presidential debate and whether or not the debate itself has changed odds for either Trump or Harris, and ultimately, who is more likely to take the White House by November. Matt Gertken is here to give us his outlook on not just the elections, but also the macroeconomic landscape. He is the chief geopolitical strategist at BCA Research. You can check out her prior interviews down below. Earlier the year, when Matt and I have been talking about this issue, he's been focused on who's going to win, and he has a very important update for us. Thank you very much for joining us once again. Thanks for coming back.
Yeah, thank you, David. It's always a pleasure to be on your show.
Pleasure to host you. First of all, we were talking about offline. You were calling for more of a Trump win earlier in July, and then now you're favoring the Democrats with, I believe you told me, 55% chance of winning. So we're going to get to that in just a minute, but I want to talk about the debate itself first. I was following the debate, and throughout the evening, Harris's poll chances on polls and as well as on betting markets seem to have risen a little bit throughout the night. So it started off with the Trump lead on Poly Market. At the end of the night, and I'll show a screenshot that I took, it was 49-49. Now today on Thursday, as we speak, it's now back to 49% Trump and 50% Harris. So slight lead in Harris's favor. Did the debate itself change anything? Did it actually change the odds in favor of Harris by the end of the night?
Well, yeah, the way that I sort of would view that, it's not the debate alone, but basically she had received a nomination bounce, and that was reflected in the opinion polling. And then you would expect that polling to sort of mellow out, which it did, and there have been a couple of polls since her nomination that have been pretty concerning for the Democratic Party. What we see with the debate is that she really held up and basically showed that she's perfectly acceptable as a candidate. She convincingly showed that voting for her would be turning the page or going to the next chapter and not going backwards. And as long as the economy is expanding with a ruling party in power after only 4 years, then that's likely to be the winning case. So basically, there was no reason to expect that she would implode the way that Biden did in late June. But what she showed is that voting for her is moving forward. And then, of course, Trump, he himself did not perform well, and many of his own supporters and many Republicans in Congress agree with that statement.
Let's talk about your outlook then. So earlier in the year, you had told me that you had favored more of a Trump victory. Now you're swinging towards the Democrats. Why the switch?
Yeah, well, specifically for the past 2 years, I've highlighted Democrats would be favored. And again, that's just historical patterns. They have a 56% chance of reelection if there's no recession. And we've basically seen there is deterioration taking place in the job market, and that's extremely critical over the next 2 months. But we are not imminently sliding into recession. And so that's a really critical question over the next 2 months. But as long as you don't see that sort of collapse into a recession, then basically Democrats are favored. Now, where I temporarily believed that Republicans were going to win was in July and August after Biden fell apart, after Trump was nearly assassinated. There was just an enormous momentum behind the party at that time. And I also expected that Harris would get a nomination bounce and it would fade. What I think we can see now is that her nomination bounce is extended. And that stems from these fundamentals and the fact that as long as you don't have, like, for example, Pennsylvania is the critical state in the election. Unemployment rate in Pennsylvania is very low and flat. It's not rising, and that's good for Harris.
Before we continue with the interview, I want to tell you about another way you can invest your Bitcoins and store them safely instead of using a traditional wallet or an exchange. Consider an IRA. Today's sponsor, iTrust Capital, is one such IRA that offers 35 crypto assets and the lowest trading fees in the crypto IRA space at 1% only. And being an IRA, it also offers unique tax benefits. If you'd like to get started and learn more, click on itrust.capital/David in the link down below or scan the QR code up here. If you're over 18 and you want to open a new account with cash or roll over an existing account, you can do so using my referral link. And if you use that referral link, you'll get $100 in signing bonuses. What would change your mind before November?
Yeah, a few things could really tip it. So to say that Harris has a 55% chance of winning is also to say that Trump still has a 45% chance, which is very high odds. And clearly then this is also a low conviction call. It depends on what happens. What really can change here, first of all, is like I mentioned, the job market is deteriorating. So Georgia, North Carolina, Michigan, Ohio, Nevada, these places are all seeing rising unemployment, and in some cases, pretty significant uptick. And that means that we are moving into the slowdown phase of the business cycle. Ultimately, we'll be going into a recession. And when the stock market gets to the point where it recognizes this, you can have a correction in the equity market. You can even sink into a bear market. And if that happens in September or October, well, that's going to be the death knell of the administration because it normally occurs that the market has a correction if we're going to have a change of party. It's a forward looking indicator. It's not that every voter cares that much about the stock market, but it would simply cancel the good vibes that Harris is enjoying as part of the ruling party. So I think that's a really critical dynamic. One other thing I would mention is global instability. We're definitely seeing decay on the international front. Biden foreign policy is coming apart at the seams. And if that results in a major crisis that embarrasses the Biden and Harris administration in an election this close, that really could tip the scales in favor of Donald Trump.
Okay, let's examine their economic policies and what may happen to the economy under either a Trump or a Harris administration. Trump again doubled down on tariffs, including a 20% levy on oil imports, up to 60% on Chinese goods. He also recently made the statement, not during the debate itself, but he made the statement earlier last week that should trading partners not cooperate with the U.S. in some way, and should they abandoned the dollar per his words, then he may consider a 100% tariff on imports from those countries. Of course, Harris during the debate shot this down, saying this was a tax on consumers. Is she right?
Well, it is true that consumer prices would go up, and companies that have to pay the tariffs would pass those on. So, and it's a tax for sure. Tariffs are a tax on trade. So that's correct. You know, the thing about this is, first of all, Trump is posing a credible threat, right? Everyone should believe President Trump when he says that he's willing to use broad-based unilateral tariffs. He almost single-handedly brought the tariffs back into, modern economic policy. And the Biden administration stuck with those tariffs and, in fact, expanded tariffs. So what we do see is that the U.S. ruling elite are generally coalescing around an economic nationalism or a protectionist stance. Now, that especially has to do with China, but of course, in Trump's case, it would involve broader protectionism, including, like you mentioned, this global tariff, which, Richard Nixon did a 10% import surcharge in 1971. So if Nixon can do it again, we should believe Trump when he says that he's willing to do it. He's doubling down on this by raising the potential for other tariffs. He said 20% on all imports, and he also said that 100% tariff on countries that de-dollarize. So I think this shows that he's pitching directly for that Midwestern voter who is, maybe works in a factory or once worked in manufacturing, has long seen the decline of U.S. industrial activity, and has really decided that it's time for the U.S. to defend its own market in the face of China. And this is a Pennsylvania bid. If Trump can win Pennsylvania, he probably wins the election. He's very likely to win Georgia, so he just needs Pennsylvania or Michigan, and he will win the election on that basis. So that's why we're going to see this protectionist rhetoric continue through the election.
What does protectionism actually do for the economy?
Well, I mean, first thing is first. What it does is it says that other countries need to negotiate with the U.S. in order to retain access to this very large and rapidly growing consumer market. So it gives the U.S. the upper hand in then going to other countries and negotiating. And that's how Trump has played it, right? I mean, Trump did negotiate the phase one trade deal with China. And so his expectation is that by starting out with tariffs, he has leverage. He can go and then get better trade deals for the U.S. But then more broadly, if we look at the effects, well, that can actually be a bad thing because the United States has insufficient savings as a country. So we're often importing goods from abroad. If we tax those imports, everyone has to pay for that. And then meanwhile, domestic companies that benefit from reduced foreign competition, they get greater pricing power. And so we have to pay more for foreign goods and we have to pay more for domestic sort of racketeering, I guess you could say. So in the end, that can be harmful for the consumer, but what it can do is protect U.S. industry from the ravages of globalization, and that's of course part of what Trump is trying to do is secure a floor for the share of manufacturing in the U.S. economy.
Harris's plan to fight inflation includes price gouging bans and also increasing the housing supply. I think it was something by the order of 5 million units that she intends to build over the coming years. Um, do you think that's going to be effective in bringing down inflation, those two things combined?
Not really. I mean, you know, the countries can use sort of intervention and attempt in certain localities to take the edge off of an acute shortage of housing or something of that nature. But generally speaking, trying to use price controls is sort of going about it the wrong way. You end up disincentivizing the production of the good that you actually want more of. And so it's an illiberal policy. It's one that does not fit with what most mainstream economists would endorse. Now, I mean, and I'm talking about price controls. When it comes to housing subsidies, I mean, you can see that that's sort of a handout that can distort the market, but it's not necessarily the end of the world. I think that in general, Harris's economic agenda is one that wants to raise taxes. And I don't think she'll be able to do that because one thing we should remember about this election, the Republicans are highly likely to win the Senate. They're almost certain to win West Virginia, and they will probably win at least Montana or Ohio. So they'll have control of the Senate, and that means she won't be able to raise taxes extensively. She also won't be able to increase spending extensively. And so this agenda will be using executive decrees and then facing pushback from the courts. So it's really not all that likely that her economic agenda will go through. And from the market perspective, that may be one positive aspect of a Harris win. And I would just caveat that obviously with if somehow the Democrats did win full control of the Senate and House with her tax hiking agenda, that would bring a very major fiscal drag into the macroeconomic outlook, and it would be perceived very negatively by markets.
All right, I want to share my screen now, and I want to show you just a clip from the debate of what Harris said in regards to her plans to stimulate the economy. Take a listen.
My plan is to give a $50,000 tax deduction to startup small businesses, knowing they are part of the backbone of America's economy. My opponent, on the other hand, his plan is to do what he has done before, which is to provide a tax cut for billionaires and big corporations, which will result in $5 trillion to America's deficit. My opponent has a plan that I call the Trump's sales tax, which would be a 20% tax on everyday goods that you rely on to get through the month. Economists have said that Trump sales tax would actually result for middle-class families in about $4,000 more a year because of his policies and his ideas about what should be the backs of middle-class people paying for tax cuts for billionaires.
A couple things to unpack here. First of all, is she right? Is Trump's platform more inflationary overall?
Well, it is more inflationary overall, yes, but that's because if you're expanding the tax cuts that he passed in 2017, you're stimulating the economy. Now, if you also pass a very rigorous border security and immigration control, then you're limiting the inflow of foreign workers to the U.S. So you're stimulating the economy, you're limiting the amount of labor that will be available. And then the tariffs sort of initially, I think, would be they could deliver a global trade shock, which would really not be inflationary. But over time, when you have those impediments to the supply side of the economy in an import-dependent economy, then yes, that would cause those consumer prices to move up. So in that way, Trump does offer an inflationary cocktail. And what it goes back to is the unwillingness to tax high income earners or especially corporations. And so then you have this widening budget deficit because he's not going to be able to slash spending, and particularly not on the really long term and mandatory spending, so like Social Security. So the spending cuts that he would be able to do would not offset the tax cuts that he would do. You'd have a larger budget deficit, and that would be inflationary. Now, her agenda would also be very inflationary, particularly the spending, but she's offering to raise revenue, which would have an offsetting effect. And meanwhile, she probably won't be able to do any of it because, as I mentioned earlier, Republicans will control the Senate.
She also mentioned that she wants to give a $50,000 break to startups, an incentive. I'm not really sure in what form that would come, either a grant or a scholarship or a loan. I'm not sure. It's not clarified, but would that help the economy?
Well, if big companies, remember, part of the agenda is not only to raise the corporate tax rate to 28% that Harris is proposing, but also taxing buybacks, maintaining a minimum tax on book income, and then also enforcing tax collection. And so all these things combined do raise the tax burden on major corporations, and especially multinationals. And so then the criticism is that, well, you're going to impinge on small business and the competitiveness of the business sector. And that's where she's trying to offset that by saying, well, in fact, we will support small businesses. And I think she would have, of course, if she were able to get this through Congress, that's an area where she would be able to even get some bipartisan support, assistance for startups and small businesses. So now, how much does it help? I mean, ultimately, the cyclical conditions of the economy will be very important there because she may be dealing with a recession as she enters office. So this would be a good incentive for small companies, but they would have to cope with that recessionary environment first, which would be, very bad for them. But ultimately, it would help to stage a recovery, and particularly in that sector. But is it sustainable to just have government handouts and to believe that that will fire innovation and business expansion? No. Ultimately, you need in an economy to have abundant labor. You need to have a clear governing framework, rule of law, and you need to have productivity advancement. And what we have in the U.S. are those things. And we also have pretty decent demographic profile, at least compared to other developed countries. So in general, there should still continue to be a pretty vibrant corporate sector and small business and innovation environment.
During the debate, Harris referenced this Penn Morton study, which suggests that the Trump budget proposal would spike the deficit by nearly 5 times as much as Harris's proposal. It says here the the federal deficit would increase by $1.2 trillion under Harris. Under Trump, it would go up by 5 times that much. Now, she didn't, of course, mention the fact that under this study, her plans would also increase the deficit by $1.2 trillion. It's just that she stressed that the study states that it would be 5.8 trillion under Trump. Now, do you agree, first of all, with the notion that either candidate would be uh, would add to the deficit and perhaps even the national debt?
Well, in general, yes, because if you think about it, none of the politicians want to come into office and impose austerity, right? That would mean shrinking the budget deficit and tightening the belt, which would be good from a fiscal point of view. It would be great for the bond market. But they don't want to do that because then what happens is you slow down the economy. And then when it comes to the next election, you're sort of in trouble. And I think that would particularly be an issue for Harris because she's a first term president if she's elected. So then she wants to be reelected in 4 years. And so she'll have to be very careful about the pacing of any tax hikes, and the sort of the willingness to actually go through with some of her proposals, which are very ambitious. But
Okay.
then on Trump's side, he's a second term president, so he's not as worried about that. But the issue there is sort of more ideological. He's just been very much a low tax guy. He's all about cutting taxes. He's actually doubled down on the idea of cutting the corporate rate from 21% to 15%. So he's clearly not in the business of fiscal discipline or consolidation, and he never has been. He's also issued long-term structural reform of entitlement spending.
Let's talk about foreign policy now. It was Gaza was brought up during the debate, and the war in Ukraine was referenced. Trump talked about the fact that under his leadership there was no major war. That he stressed that several times. Who do you think would be more stable, I guess, if you want to use that word, for the global stage?
Look, unfortunately for the world, neither the U.S. election is not going to decide the course of geopolitics it has the biggest influence, but it's not alone going to be the deciding factor. And in order to stabilize the world system today, we need the US and China to have a new understanding and a new way of living with each other. And that would essentially have two components. One, no war over Taiwan. Let's agree to disagree, but not have a war on Taiwan. And the other part of it would be let's not attack each other's economies. If we're imposing punitive measures on each other's economies, then we can destabilize each other's economies, which threatens the regime's political, survival and makes them very erratic and very aggressive with each other. And so that can be destabilizing for the world. So you'd need to have that U.S.-China agreement. And then also, of course, you need to have a U.S.-Russia agreement to essentially neutralize Ukraine, not allow Ukraine to join NATO, and then have Russia pull back and stop invading other countries. And so now how do we get to that? Well, the NATO 75th anniversary, the decision was made to continue to push for Ukraine to join NATO. So that's not on the offering from the Western countries, and Russia will therefore continue to prosecute the war very aggressively. And so if you look at what happens, if Trump wins the election, he's going to continue some unilateral policies that could be highly destabilizing, especially when it comes to trade and especially when it comes to China. When we talk about Harris winning, first of all, she's going to have a massive showdown with Russia almost immediately as a result of the refusal to back down on Ukraine. But then also, ultimately, later on, she will too have a problem with China, having to do with attempting to control their access to high technology, imposing export controls, and enforcing U.S. allies and partners to enforce those same controls. That constrains China's economy. So we're looking at a really rocky geopolitical environment under either candidate. Trump would be willing to negotiate a ceasefire on Ukraine, but he'd really escalate global instability both in trade and in confronting Iran and heating things up in the Middle East. Harris would not, she'd have the escalation going on in Ukraine. She might negotiate with Iran, but both of them would have a problem with China.
Let's take a look one more time on my screen. This is Trump's he comments on sanctions and his approach to dealing with Iran. Take a listen.
In her own way, she hates the Arab population because the whole place is going to get blown up. Arabs, Jewish people, Israel will be gone. It would have never happened. Iran was broke under Donald Trump. Now Iran has $300 billion because they took off all the sanctions that I had. Iran had no money for Hamas or Hezbollah or any of the 28 different spheres of terror. And they are spheres of terror, horrible terror. They had no money. It was a big story, and you know it. You covered it very well, actually. They had no money for terror. They were broke. Now they're a rich nation.
So he's basically saying that sanctions work. Do they work?
Well, he's not wrong about the fact that the U.S. was imposing sanctions on oil and enforcing them, and therefore Iran was starved of cash. And Iran was, of course, also lashing out, and we had a higher risk of oil supply disruptions under his administration. Even though he didn't want to have a war with Iran, we were driving in the direction of a major conflict. And I think he would resume that because effectively what he'll do is he'll say, and it's not just Trump, by the way, this has been the Republican Party policy, is we'll enforce these sanctions, we'll isolate Iran, and we will tell them that they need to freeze their nuclear program, and that's the end of the discussion. And if they continue to pursue nuclear weapons, then we'll conduct airstrikes. In fact, John McCain in the 2008 election was singing "Bomb Iran." So this has been a Republican policy of giving an ultimatum and stopping them from getting a nuclear weapon and being shoulder to shoulder with Israel on that issue. And if Trump wins, I think that will continue to be the policy, and I think it will increase the odds of a conflict in the region. Now, go ahead.
Earlier in the summer, we talked about the probability of an outright war breaking out between Israel and Iran, and you had a flow chart. People can revisit that interview. I'll put the link down below. Have your odds shifted there for that?
No, odds have not changed there. And what that showed was that we were very likely to have an escalation with Hezbollah in Lebanon, and we did ultimately. Israel attacked Hezbollah preemptively, and there's still a lot of heat there, and it can continue to flare. But what it also showed is that we had a major risk that the Israeli-Iranian tensions would blow up, and we would end up with Iraq or the Persian Gulf or certain areas seeing oil shocks. Now that was not our base case, but it was a high risk. We gave it a 1/3 probability. Now those odds will go up after the U.S. election, because after the election, President Biden can roll up his sleeves and he can go to Iran and say, hey, listen, I tried to negotiate with you. I didn't enforce the sanctions. I negotiated a prisoner swap with you and enabled you to get access to some of your frozen funds around the world. And what did you do? You went and attacked Israel through your proxy groups, and you attacked international shipping, and that's got to stop. So Biden can do that initially, whether Harris or Trump wins. And then Harris will have to issue a shot across the bow. I'm willing to negotiate, but you're going to have to play by the rules. And meanwhile, Trump, like I said, will probably pursue maximum pressure. So I definitely think that after the election, we'll see a bigger risk of conflict with Iran. Now, depending on the outcome, Democrats will probably lead us down the path of more negotiations. But we should definitely be aware of this risk because, well, let's just think about it this way. Oil price is falling because recession odds are going up, and that can continue until a recession is priced. But when you get on the other side, if we have a destabilization in the Middle East because Iran is pursuing a nuclear weapon, then we will ultimately have relevant oil supply constraints.
Okay, let's finish up in the markets then. Right after the debate on Wednesday morning, stock markets briefly fell, partly also on the back of a slightly weaker than expected CPI report, and then it rallied again. Anyway, my point is, do you think that Harris win, should she win, would be bearish for markets, as some pundits have speculated it would be, primarily due to her tax policies?
Not really. Well, one thing is the stock market normally rallies after the election regardless. It's just a removal of uncertainty. Now, in this case, the election could be so close, and we have swing states maybe doing recounts or litigation. So we may not have a solid answer until the Electoral College votes in mid-December, right? So there's plenty of room for volatility short term, and we may not have an immediate answer that we need. But once we know the result of the election, then Harris is bearish if Democrats win full control. Now, to be clear, for a party to win a full sweep like they did in 2020 and then lose it like they did in 2022 and then reclaim it, that's a very rare event. That's the only time I know of that happened in modern memory is in 1948. So Democrats should not be in full control. They're likely to lose seats in the Senate, and probably Republicans will retain the House. And that's because people are upset with inflation and the rising joblessness in certain states. So I don't think she'll win a full sweep. I don't think Democrats will do that. But that would be the bearish outcome, because that's where then you would see that corporate tax rate go up, and you would immediately have to adjust for corporate earnings. And that would be a downgrade of corporate earnings, and the market would have to discount that.
What is your base case then for the S&P 500 by the end of the year?
Oh, well, in my view, the S&P is going to fall. I don't give I'm a geopolitical strategist, right? Sure. I don't give a number for that, but I think that we can see it fall below 4,000. And the reason is because this pattern of falling job openings and rising unemployment, this leads ultimately to a recession. You don't normally have cases where the unemployment rate starts rising to the extent that it has, and then it just flatlines and goes back down. That never happens. And when the Fed starts cutting interest rates, it doesn't prevent recessions. Well, they're cutting interest rates because the labor market's cooling, because the economy is slowing down. So they won't be able to stop that recessionary process, and that's what's going to bring the earnings expectations down and the multiples down in the stock market.
Excellent. Appreciate your thoughts. Thank you for it, Matt. Where can we learn from your work?
BCA Research. We've been doing it since 1949.
All right, excellent. I'll put the link down below. People should check out BCA Research. Appreciate it once again. I hope to speak with you soon, and closer to the election, I'm sure there's more news. So thanks for coming on.
Thank you, David.
Thank you for watching. Don't forget to like and subscribe.